Boom, 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 boom. Oh, that's good. Oh, hello. Fancy seeing you here. How you doing? You're looking well. That's a fancy shirt you're wearing. I bet that was expensive. Anyway, sit down, make yourself at home. Fancy a cuppa? Hello everyone, thank you for joining me again and welcome to any new viewers. This is To The Point English with Ben. I'm Ben, and in this video we're going to look at the many meanings and uses of the word fancy. Now fancy can be an adjective, it can be a verb, it can be a noun, and according to Cambridge it could be a B1 vocabulary, B2 vocabulary, or even up to C2 level vocabulary. Now, by the way, I only mention these levels of vocabulary because I know many of you are preparing for a Cambridge English exam, but in the real world nobody really cares about the levels of vocabulary, it's all just vocabulary. But yeah, this word fancy, it's extremely useful and extremely versatile because, as I said, it can be used in so many different situations. But it can be a little bit confusing for English learners for that very reason, because it has so many different meanings and uses. Sometimes it's difficult to know exactly when and how to use it. So in this video, we're going to look at the different uses in the different parts of speech, so the adjective, verb, and noun. And I'm going to give you plenty of examples just to make sure you really understand it. As always, I recommend that you come up with your own examples, make this personal, emotional connection, because that's the best way to really understand vocabulary. So first we're going to look at the meanings and uses of fancy when it's used as an adjective. And the first one we're going to look at is when we use it as a synonym for expensive or posh, that kind of idea. So, for example, Steve's got a fancy new car. It's an Aston Martin, I think. Okay, so Steve's got a new car, a fancy new car. It's not just any car. It's not a Ford, it's not a Seat, it's not a Peugeot. It's an Aston Martin. It's expensive and posh. It's a little bit special. So it's a little bit ostentatious. It's designed to impress people. And the second meaning of the word fancy when it's used as an adjective is specifically that, what we just said. It's intended to impress. So the first meaning of being expensive and posh, maybe the intention is to impress, but not necessarily. But this second meaning is if something is fancy, then it's intended to impress. And I'm going to give you an example which I think you can all probably relate to. In the writing paper of the exam, it's a good idea to use some fancy vocabulary to really impress the examiners. So that's true, of course, in the higher level exams especially, you want to use some fancy vocabulary. So some, not just normal vocabulary, like low level or basic vocabulary. You want to use some more maybe sophisticated vocabulary, but really it's vocabulary that is intended to impress. In this case, it's intended to impress the examiners, so fancy vocabulary. And the third meaning of fancy when used as an adjective is decorative or elaborate or ostentatious. So all of these meanings are quite similar. They kind of overlap in some ways, but they're also different in many ways too. As I said, it always depends on the context. So this example is what I used in the introduction to this video when I said, that's a fancy shirt, I bet it was expensive. So maybe it was expensive or maybe it wasn't. The fact is that it's quite decorative. It's not just a plain shirt like this. This shirt I'm wearing today is not fancy, it's very plain. But if you wear a shirt with flowers and bright colors, then it's fancy. Maybe it's expensive, maybe it's intended to impress. But in this use of the meaning fancy, that's not necessarily true. It may be or it may not be. It's just fancy. Maybe it was bought from a cheap shop, but it has a fancy decorative pattern on it, or it has very bright, loud colors. Of course, you could be speaking about somebody's house, for example, the way they decorate their house with fancy wallpaper. It's not just plain, boring wallpaper. It has a decorative pattern. So again, depending on the context, you can use it in many different situations. So let's move on to the meaning and uses of fancy as a verb in English. And the first meaning is to feel like doing or having something. And this example, again, was from my introduction when I said, fancy a cuppa. So really I'm asking, do you fancy a cup of tea? in normal situations, in colloquial situations, we don't form the complete sentence. But the grammatically correct and complete sentence would be, do you fancy a cup of tea? Specifically tea. If you say a cuppa, it's a cup of tea, not a cup of coffee or a cup of hot chocolate or anything else. If somebody offers you a cuppa in England or in Britain, it's a cup of tea. So as I said, that question is really asking, do you feel like having a cup of tea? Another very common use of fancy with this meaning is when you say, oh, I fancy a pint. Should we go down the pub? So again, very British English, this very British English concept, but also vocabulary. I fancy a pint. So it's I feel like having a pint. So shall we go down the pub? And that means shall we go to the pub for a pint of beer? Again, if we say a pint in England without any more specific information, then we are referring to a pint of beer. It's not a pint of milk or a pint of wine or a pint of vodka or anything else. If you say fancy a pint, it's a pint of beer. And the second meaning of fancy as a verb is to be attracted to someone. It's usually used by younger people. Adults don't usually use this verb. It's a little bit immature, perhaps, but it's common, so you may hear it. And the example is, all the girls at school fancied my best friend. Yeah, I know, it's very sad, isn't it? But it's okay. I've moved on. I'm over it now. Anyway, moving on to the third meaning of fancy as a verb. And again, the example is from the introduction to this video when I said, fancy seeing you here. So in this case, it's used as an expression of surprise. So when I said fancy seeing you here, it's like, oh, I didn't expect it to see you here. It's a surprise. Maybe it's a nice surprise. It's usually a nice surprise. It's not usually negative. And another expression where we use fancy in this way is when we simply say, oh, fancy that. Fancy that. So that it's a little bit old-fashioned, this. You do still hear people in Britain saying this expression, using this expression, but it's perhaps not so common among younger people. So again, fancy that is just an expression of surprise. So you could say, I saw my old headmaster in the market today, and they could respond by saying, oh, fancy that. And that just means, oh, that's interesting, that's a surprise. And one more meaning of fancy when we use it as a verb is when you believe that a team or an individual or someone is going to win something. Okay, this one's a bit more confusing, so you really need some examples. So if I ask you, who do you fancy for the Champions League this year? Who do you fancy for the Champions League? It's really asking, who do you think is going to win the Champions League? So which football team do you think is going to win the Champions League? So you could say, oh, I'm not sure. I fancy Real Madrid. So you believe, you think that Real Madrid is going to win. In another slightly different context, you could say, John really fancies his chances for that promotion at work. So John really fancies his chances for that promotion at work. Obviously, there is an opportunity for a promotion in John's workplace, and he thinks he's got a good chance. He thinks he can win the promotion, so to speak. Okay, and moving on to fancy as a noun now. And it's usually used in expressions, idiomatic expressions as a noun. So I have 3 idioms for you that contain the word fancy. Now, you may notice that fancy sounds very similar to fantasy said very quickly, right? Fancy, fantasy, 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 fancy, fancy, fancy. And I think that will help you understand the meaning of these nouns in these fixed expressions. The first one is to tickle your fancy. To tickle your fancy. Any idea what that means? That means to like or want something. So if you say, does anything tickle your fancy? It's like asking, do you want anything here? Do you like anything here? Often used when you have different options. So when you go shopping, for example, or perhaps when you're in a restaurant looking at the menu and deciding what to order. And that's my example. So imagine you're sitting with your friend in a restaurant, you're just looking at the menus, deciding what to order, and you ask, is there anything that tickles your fancy on the menu? So is there anything that tickles your fancy? Is there anything that you really, really want or really like? And the second idiomatic expression with fancy is a flight of fancy. A flight of fancy. So again, you can imagine this being related to fantasy because the meaning is imaginative but unrealistic idea. So it's unrealistic is important here. So if you have an idea and it's very imaginative, very creative. It's like a fantasy. In fact, it's such a fantasy that it's unrealistic. It's not based on real possibilities. So again, the example, she wants to pass the C2 proficiency exam. It's not a flight of fancy. I think she can really do it. Okay, so in this case, I'm using it in the negative to emphasize that I think she has a good and realistic chance of passing the C2 proficiency exam. So she has this idea that she can pass the C2 proficiency. Maybe for some people it sounds like a fantasy. It sounds impossible or very, very unlikely. But in my opinion, as her teacher, maybe I can say, no, it's not a flight of fancy. I think she can do it. So she has a realistic chance of passing the exam. And the final idiom with fancy is a passing fancy. A passing fancy. Again, if you think of passing fantasy, you're in the right idea. It has basically the same meaning. And it's referring to something that you like a lot, but just for a short period. So it could be a hobby or something you like doing, but it doesn't last very long. Last year I took up ballet dancing, but it was just a passing fancy. Okay, that's not true. I didn't take up ballet dancing last year. It was 2 years ago. No, but it was just a passing fancy. So I took it up and I was into it. I really enjoyed it. But after maybe a couple of months, I lost interest. I didn't like it anymore, so I stopped. So it was just a passing fancy. So any hobby, any activity you really enjoy and you really like for a short period of time, you can describe as a passing fancy. And of course, I can't end this video without talking about maybe the most common use of fancy internationally, and that's fancy dress. Fancy dress. So of course, fancy dress, I'm sure you know, is when people dress up in costumes for things like Halloween, maybe Christmas, or fancy dress parties. So you could dress up as a famous person, or as a monster, as a clown, a witch, whatever. I'm sure you're familiar with that. In that case, it doesn't really fit in with the rest of the meanings here. But again, it's from originally fantasy, so like fantasy dress. You're dressing up as a fantasy character. It's unreal. It's not the real world. Okay, as always, think of your own examples, put them in the comments. I would love to see those, and I'll see you very soon for another video. Bye.